There it is.
All right, here we go. Welcome to another episode of the Non-Vaccinators Podcast. I am here with Tony Rhine, and since the last time I talked to you, I know that you've had like some pretty big developments in what you do.
Hmm.
So rather than me try to explain all that, I'm just going to hand that
Yeah.
over to you.
I like the script that we had that says Tony does cool neuro
Yeah,
stuff because that's
it's
all you really
awesome.
need to know. No, I was telling you I have NeuroWay Solutions and NeuroWay Tactical now. So I have a government consulting branch that's more for like law enforcement, military,
Okay.
and then I have more of a corporate wellness branch. So a little bit more working with organizations, still doing
Hmm.
a few individual clients, but
Right.
more pushing myself into those larger facilities and kind of impacting larger groups of people that need
Okay.
it. So it's been
Okay.
really good, man. It's been enjoyable.
So I know that like the last time we talked, you kind of went into some of what you do and kind of the importance of it,
Hmm.
and talked a lot about neuroplasticity.
Hmm.
Can you give kind of like a rundown on, I guess, why that's important or like why that impacts so many different things?
Yeah. In what context? Just so.
So, because I know that like some of it, the work that you had done was dealing with people who had PTSD,
Hmm.
that had uh, just all kinds of like imbalances, like in the body
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. So, I mean, obviously, the brain is our control center;
Hmm.
it's doing
Yeah. Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
being able to, I know you knew like a lot of exercises just with the eyes
Yep.
and how that interacts with different systems.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So if you want to simplify it, I usually tell people the brain does three things.
mhm,
It has to take an input, has to make a decision about it and interpret that input, and then it has to give you an output. And
okay,
so anywhere along the spectrum, we could be getting outputs that are geared towards protecting us, more
mhm,
survival based outputs like pain or tension or things like this, things that'll keep us from doing stuff that our brain deems as dangerous in the moment.
right,
Or you could get more performance based outputs, which are speed, strength, quicker processing, things like that.
mhm,
So, depending on how that first part of the loop is working, where I'm taking an input and then interpreting it and making a decision about it,
mhm,
will typically determine the output. So,
right,
if you want to change anything or work along that spectrum from survival to performance, you might want to look at the input or the interpretation and integration of that input,
right,
right? So that's
okay,
essentially what I do.
I
So
gotcha.
is go, hey, like if fitness is a good example. They're like, ah,
Mhm,
your squat looks bad, or you have pain or tension here, whatever.
mhm,
They want to focus on the output and change the output. They
mhm,
don't necessarily look at, hey, your knee might be hurting on a squat because your vestibular system, which is giving you information about your head moving up and down,
mhm,
might be compromised. You might have had TBI. You might have got hit in the head when you were playing high school football,
right,
right? That might be why you have back and knee pain.
mhm,
And all of that information that's coming from that system might be compromised. So if we work on that system, maybe we fix your squat, maybe we fix your pain.
right.
Simple like that, right?
So
Um,
then it's more than just the biomechanics of like how your body is aligned and that sort of thing.
yep. And why are the
Yeah,
biomechanics the way that they are? Why is
right.
the muscle tension reflexively the way
Mhm,
that it is, that it's creating this type of movement pattern that we don't deem as acceptable?
mhm,
It's probably because some of those systems in charge of creating that reflexive tone or creating the way that those muscles are interacting with each other,
mhm,
like the software is running the hardware, right?
right,
So why are we just looking at the hardware? Not that the hardware is not important.
right,
It's got to be up to scratch. But at the same time, if you don't look at the whole system,
mhm,
like you're probably missing a lot,
right.
right? So that's that's not necessarily a long-winded way, but in a kind of
Mhm,
roundabout way, that's essentially what we're looking at.
right.
So
So I kind of wanted to go backwards a little bit and
mhm.
kind of understand from where you started in your education, how did you get specifically to where you are now?
All my personal issues. Frankly, that's it. I mean, I played. Well, I grew up with Hashimoto, so I think we had talked about it last time,
Yeah, we did.
where I
Mhm,
had a lot of like thyroid metabolic issues growing up. That started when I was like 5. So I was on
mhm,
synthetic uh, levothyroxine, which is just synthetic thyroid hormone, until I was about 17 or 18, getting blood work done every 4 to 6 months. So like it stemmed this thing where like as a 5 or 6 year old being conscious about health conditions is like probably not normal.
right.
But I was very conscious of that stuff. And it created some weight issues growing up. So I kind of always had this awareness of that human performance thing in the back of my head because I'm like, oh, this is different. Like I have to work harder at sports. I have to train on my own. Like what 14-year-old is going and running 3 miles a day and lifting every day, like just to try to keep up so he can stay on his competitive
Mhm,
sports team. Like it's not that many, I don't
right.
think. It's not common. Um, so that being said, after all that, was able to help remedy that issue with a lot of nutritional just intentional nutritional work when I was about 18 and just got off of that medication. But then as I got into, I did some competitive soccer, some very low level, like professional and semi-professional soccer.
Hmm.
And I was just picking up injuries, and I did some boxing in college as well. I did a bunch of different sports things. I just always was
Hmm.
active. But those injuries added up and created a lot of pain issues for myself.
Right.
And then in about 2017, I was already in the training industry for 7, 8 years at that point, doing personal training and like fitness work, strength conditioning work. Um, but then that's when I really was like dealing with my own personal issues and
Hmm.
needed to go find a solution. And that's when I got into the neurology of everything and understood pain neurobiology and understood all the systems that
Hmm.
helped me figure out why I was having the pain issues and the movement issues that I was having. For
Right.
sure. Hmm.
And was most of that just like self-study? You were just kind of like learning these things on your own, or was there
No.
an actual
Mm.
education program that you went for that?
Yeah. Great question. No, I had learned stuff from some different people and taken bits and pieces here and there. However, I had come across a company called Z Health Education or Z Health Performance Solutions, whatever they were going by at the time, and they did world class education in functional neurology for
Hmm.
health and fitness pros.
I
And so
gotcha.
I had known about them from a professional powerlifter that I had known since like 2011. And so he had told me about them. So I had them in the back burner, kind of on their blog.
Hmm.
And then I went to a class in 2017 and was like, okay, this is exactly what I need to do. So I went through all of their courses over the next 3, 4 years. And then I ended up working for them after about 2 years. At 2019, I started working for them. And so that I could go travel and help assist, teach, and do some sales for them and a couple other things. So that was a cool opportunity that I got to do for a few years as well.
Hmm.
Hmm.
That's really cool.
Yeah. So smarter people than me. Like I always tell people like people call me a subject matter expert when I go places. I'm like, I'm really not. Like there are people that I know that are subject matter experts.
Right.
I'm just here communicating concepts that smarter people than me have put together,
Hmm.
and I'm trying to bridge the gap between basically normal people or people that I care about in certain places, like
Hmm.
these police officers and these military dudes, and help them get access to this information that isn't necessarily so mainstream
Right.
in health and fitness and human performance, generally speaking. So.
Right. So when I was, I actually was a personal trainer. I
Mhm.
did that for about a year, and I went through like a program to teach you to all of the bones, all of the muscles, just like all of the kind of standard things that you learn as a personal trainer, right?
Yep.
And then after that, I became a massage therapist, went even deeper into like learning more about the body and tried to being healing people and that sort of thing. And that
Mhm.
I was much happier with because it
Mhm.
felt like I was accomplishing a lot more on that side of things.
Yes. Mhm.
Um, and then around the time that CrossFit really started to kind of become a thing,
Mhm.
and understanding the difference in the thought process and focusing on the whole body as a as a functional unit rather than like static motion of just like when you're working on biceps you're only going to move this one plane of motion, that sort of
Mhm.
thing.
Yeah.
It like really highlighted how much difference there was between the static sort of training that everybody gets.
Mhm.
You're going to do 3 sets of 10 of this and then you're done.
Mhm.
That
Yeah.
kind of thing, that sort of like thinking
Mentality.
about how they're going to train
Mhm.
and how antiquated that is compared to a lot of the things that are coming out. So the whole idea of studying things to like an even greater degree
Mhm.
seems really important. And it's unfortunate that that's such a specialized thing that it isn't just part of kind of the normal training for people that do those sorts of things.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Generally. I mean, we especially with Z Health, when I work for them, there's so many people that are just hungry, like good people, because mostly people are not getting into the training industry because they're trying to make a bunch of money. Like
Right.
it's not that lucrative unless you kind of make it big on a social media platform or something. So they really do care about people. So you'd have a ton of people that were just very hungry for this type of information, like
Hmm.
practitioners, like
Right.
in varying fields that really appreciated it for that exact reason. Where you're like, hey, there's a bigger system at play here. Like
Right.
it might not just be like you have a tight muscle because you have a knot there. Like why?
Yeah,
Keep
exactly.
asking that question why, and you'll kind of go back to you'll go back to the brain in the majority of cases.
Hmm.
So that's why I do neuro-based stuff
Right.
because you pretty much go back to the brain, or at least you go back to some part of an anatomical system and go, it's not the thing you're looking at that's the problem.
Right.
It's the 3 steps before it, or this other thing that's way deeper below
Yeah.
the surface. So,
So I always kind of make the connection. There's the body and then there's the mind.
mhm,
Those two systems oddly enough, or maybe not oddly, they very much mirror each other. So the same sort of thing that you're talking about on the physical, and the neurological side is happening on the emotional side. The thing that you're upset about may not be the thing you're upset about. It's fucking three things deep
Hmm.
that you're not even paying attention
Yeah.
to or don't even realize
Yeah.
that is the the cause of what's going on.
Yeah. So if you go back to that whole little input, interpretation, decision, output,
Hmm.
emotions are an output. They're a
Yeah.
motor output. The word motion is in the word,
Right.
right? So it's a motor output from your brain. Like I can tell you the
Hmm.
brain area that's responsible for assigning emotional content to a given degree of or a given array of incoming stimulus,
Hmm.
right? So like because that's an output, again, we can go back to input and go like, hey, maybe your vision was tired that day because you were
Right.
sitting in front of a computer for 10 hours and that's why you're very irritable,
Hmm.
right? It doesn't have to be this. Like to me, those things aren't necessarily separate because
Right.
usually there is that drawing of a line between there's mind, there's body, there's this. I'm like, no, it's one big system, bro.
Hmm.
Like it's all connected,
Right.
right? Like you can see, I used to have a client who would deal with his ex-wife, and anytime he would deal with his ex-wife would be basically the precursor for his back pain. And I was like, cool, we got to deal with like, we do have to deal with the physiological elements that are dealing with this back pain, but like,
Yeah.
can we make the connection that like there's a psychological or social element rather, um,
Hmm.
this whole thing? Because there's a there is some literature on what's called the biopsychosocial model where these
Right.
things all kind of integrate together.
Yeah.
Um, so you talk to a guy like that and you're like, yeah, man, we could keep like talking about your back and like we will do the stuff to make your back feel better because I know I have stuff in my toolbox to help you with that.
Hmm.
At the same time, like 5 minutes of you venting to me and for lack of a better term, just bitching about your wife
Yeah.
kind of made you feel a little bit better. And now we can move on. And now
Right.
your back feels better. But
Yeah.
it's having the maturity and the actual understanding to know like these things they don't
Right.
exist in a vacuum.
Yeah.
The system works together, it
Hmm.
heals together, it gets hurt together. Like it's
Right.
one big system, right?
Well, along that same line, the things that you're having people do, like the exercises and things that you're having them do, they're not like in a vacuum. They don't just you don't just do this one thing and then you're done, right? You kind of have to make that part of is it more like a workout routine where it's something that you just sort of do on a regular basis to kind of like keep in balance?
Mhm. In some senses, yes. So individual folks, if we've gotten to a degree where they have drills that they know work for them as an individual,
Hmm.
I will tell them, yeah, like do those drills consistently and you will see good results. Dan was a really good example of that, right?
Right.
When you heard him talking to me about how he's feeling, he's starting to train again. He's
Hmm.
just like, hey, my back and knees don't hurt. Like I can throw around weights again. Like that's super cool
Hmm.
because he has individualized stuff that he can stay very consistent with and use before he trains
Right.
so that he can be in a more optimal state to be able to move weight around. In that same sense, there is some standardized stuff I do with larger organizations because I
Hmm.
maybe don't have the resources to do that with each individual.
Right.
Uh, so it really depends. I try as much as I can to make things passive where they can just, it can be a part of their environment to do
Hmm.
that training as opposed to like this very regimented thing because behavior change is hard for people and doing extra work is not really on the top of their agenda,
Yeah. Definitely.
right? Uh, so I would say it just depends on the context. In some senses, yes, you have to go train. That's how you get good at anything, man. Like
Right.
you got to practice stuff.
Hmm.
And the other sense, cool. If I have you do a set of vision drills,
Hmm.
but you live in a like visual stimulus rich environment and you're working all the time, like so these cops that are out on the street,
Hmm.
like, hey, I might just have you do this vision work as a little program thing, and you're gonna train the skills in isolation
Hmm.
in your bubble, and then
Right.
when you go out on the street, you're gonna use them all. So you're practicing them again. You're just practicing better reps when you get out on the street.
Right.
Does that make sense? So I don't
Hmm.
the volume looks different based on people's environment. And
I
that's what
gotcha.
that's what like when we talk about neuroplasticity, and
Hmm.
neuroplasticity is just people's brains and body's ability to adapt to things and basically rechange the anatomy of how you're structured. That is highly dependent on environment.
Hmm.
So people that sit in front of a screen all day,
Right.
right? They're going to start to adapt to be good at that one thing. Your
Hmm.
brain's super efficient at that. So they'll start to get really good at that,
Hmm.
which means you're going to get worse at other things
Right.
that don't require those same skills, right? Does that make
So
sense?
how else would you explain that?
So like if you sit in front of a computer screen
Right. Right.
and your eyes are converged, so they're looking in at a close
Hmm.
target that's like 3 feet from you, and your
Hmm.
lenses are getting really tight so that you can focus on that screen,
Hmm.
and your neck posture starts to adapt forward like that so that you
Right.
can see better.
Hmm.
you're getting really good at looking at that screen and reading on that screen and all those things.
Right.
Does that make me better if I'm going to go do CQB in the shoot house upstairs?
No.
No, those things are all actually really bad adaptations if I want to be good at that.
Yeah.
Those are all counterproductive adaptations.
Mm-hmm.
But because I spend so much time doing this thing, like sitting in front of this computer screen,
Mm-hmm.
my brain goes, well, you must really value this. And we're going to do this a lot. So I'm going to make sure you're really good at this.
Right.
It's not your brain's fault. It's just the environment you're putting it in. And it's going, hey, let's adapt and get good. Because
Mm-hmm.
it wants efficiency. It wants to use as little fuel as possible. So if I
Right.
get you good at this thing, this is a good thing because we do this all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that happens to be really not a good thing if we're going to go upstairs and do the shoot house.
Right.
So it's when I say environment is
Mm-hmm.
dictating those adaptations, that's kind of what I mean.
Right.
So whatever you do, you're going to get good at.
Gotcha.
Like bar none. The way you interact with people, you're going to get good at it.
Yeah.
The way you, yeah, the type. If you're around shitty people
Mm-hmm.
and y'all are toxic and gossipy, like you're going to
Right.
get really good at that. And right, that's because that's the way you think. You're going to change.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to rewire the way you think.
Right.
Right. In the same sense, if you're in a terrible visual environment, you're going to
Right.
have terrible visual skills. Right. Does that
So
make sense?
yeah, it
Yeah.
does.
Cool. Yeah.
So like with the people that you train, like what sort of things have you seen that were like really distinct differences that you could kind of like measure or use as an example for people?
And say that one more time for me.
So like when you're training, like let's say police,
Mhm.
law enforcement, that sort of thing, like what sort of things do you see that are really remarkable that you can say this is you went from here to here in the things?
Yeah, you'll see. So with some of the stuff we've done, and even like training academy situations, one of the cooler things that like it's stuff I don't think about as much because I kind of let the data try to come back.
Hmm.
One of the more fun things that I would see was we did a set of vision drills just to warm up
Hmm.
before these kids. They're academy kids, so they had a report writing class, but they performed better than like any other class did on that report writing class in previous academy classes
Hmm.
or recruiting classes. Um, and basically, a lot of those visual skills translate to memory and focus and other like cognitive skills
Hmm.
that most people don't necessarily associate with them.
Hmm.
So, this is stuff I talk to leadership about. I'm like, oh, people will think better, they'll make better decisions, they'll have better focus, blah 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 blah. It's
Right.
all nice. It sounds good, and it's
Hmm.
like there's literature to back it. You can find it. It's just
Hmm.
it's fun to see in the environment to go like, oh yeah, like everyone did better on this class. I'm like, yeah, obviously.
Right.
I just in my head I was like, yeah, that makes that no surprise there. And they're like, wait, that's really surprising. I'm like, no, it's not. You have to explain it to you. There's just things like that. But
Right.
if it's that simple on a report writing skill too, it's the same
Hmm.
thing where we're seeing with shooting or anything else. Like you're going to
Hmm.
see different different shooting times, different abilities to react, different visual processing times if you train the skills that are required, right?
Hmm.
So if you actually just isolate it and do the work and then integrate it into the environment that you want, then the
Right.
skills will translate. Yeah.
That's a good thing.
I mean, hopefully that answered your question. I
Yeah.
was like that was like that was a fun little story that I thought was cute because I was like, oh, these guys literally have no idea that vision relates to focus. And like
Right.
I've worked on so many people with like
Hmm.
ADD, and I'm like, oh, you clearly have like I would call it oculomotor dysfunction. So oculo is eye, motor is movement. So eye
Hmm.
movement dysfunction. You have eye
Okay.
movement issues. And yeah, like that relates to focus. So all of a
Okay.
sudden you get a bunch of 20 to 25-year-olds in an academy class that have sat in screens most of their life
Hmm.
and they have eye movement issues. And I go,
Right.
cool, like let's do eye movement work. And then let's go test your memorization and like executive function skills.
Right.
I'm like, yes, yeah, that should in theory work out well. And it
Hmm.
did. And I was like, cool,
There you go.
awesome.
Yeah. So
Simple stuff like that.
that's the sort of thing I was thinking, like
Yeah.
something you could like say we kind of started here, and because of this, you can see a clear difference,
Hmm.
in like the output.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, that can relate to any environment, right?
Hmm.
That can be us doing like movement motor control work before we
Hmm.
go do DT work, is what they call it, defensive tactics. Let's call it grappling, fighting, combatives, whatever.
Hmm.
Uh, but yeah, if you do some good motor control work before you go do combatives, even if you go do some good visual work before you do combatives, right?
Right.
All my hand-eye coordination stuff is a little more accurate. I'm a little bit quicker. I'm a little bit sharper. I make decisions faster, right? Because all
Right.
that decision-making stuff
Yeah.
is kind of where those eye movement areas live in that frontal lobe.
Hmm.
So yeah, you could literally, that's the beauty of it. And that's kind of why I ask specifics of what you're looking for. Is I'm
Hmm.
like, dude, whatever you want to get better at, it lives in the brain. So
Right.
we can monitor and modulate stimulus to be able to help people train and adapt for whatever environment they want to be good at.
Right.
That's what's
So,
cool.
um, I guess like on a military side of things,
Mhm.
and probably law enforcement too, because they do have to like identify targets and
Mhm.
you know shoot or not shoot, that sort of things.
Yep.
Um, but when you're moving, let's say somebody who's actually in a war zone,
Mhm.
and they're moving through, different environments and things like that, what sort of things do they do that's maybe different than what a typical law enforcement person or somebody else would do?
Yeah. Again, depending on context, right, and depending on job. So there's a lot of different tasks people do in the
Right,
military, right?
right.
So depending on who you're working with, I've gotten the good fortune of working with a lot of pilots and like
Hmm.
their human performance organizations recently, which has been cool. So like that job looks very different than, are you talking about like operators like out in
I'm
the
I'm
field
thinking
or
more like door kickers.
like door kickers? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and depending on like that could be having a certain like pre-game time routine, if you will,
Hmm.
where you're like, hey, this type of breath work kind of puts me in the right zone where my autonomics are like on point,
Hmm.
or like my heart rate and my blood
Right.
pressure and all that stuff is like working properly.
Yeah, I remember the last time we talked, you had mentioned something about they do like box breathing drills.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah,
common one that the
yeah,
military
yeah.
likes to do. Yeah.
So
Hmm.
exactly how does that work?
Yeah, and box breathing is like the very like classic example that people
Hmm.
do, or like combat breathing, right?
Hmm.
There's I would just say, like, I feel like there's like infinite amount of good like
Okay.
breathing drills. Something
Right.
more called cyclic sighing these days is a little more popular. I think Huberman and like Stanford Med had done a research article on it, and it had shown more positive like emotional and like cognitive effects.
Hmm.
However, essentially the same place that regulates a lot of your autonomics, your brainstem,
Hmm.
you can impact it through breathing because there's different parts of your brainstem that are responsible for different things like rate of breath, inhalation, exhalation, like
Hmm.
how all that stuff works. So you can essentially impact it by doing some very conscious breathing work.
Hmm.
It will help regulate that whole autonomic system in a way.
I gotcha.
Vision work will do things similarly as well. They used to use, you might have seen on my Instagram page, a little near far drill where you're switching between
Hmm.
targets.
Right.
They used to use that, and I would have to go back and find the paper if you want it. Uh, but they used to use it for like panic attacks and like anxiety induced
Hmm.
attacks. They would just have like, they would hold convergence for a while and then they would diverge their eyes out. And that little bit of eye movement and just focusing your eyes and
Hmm.
being able to like fixate on a target would
Right.
just like settle people out of that.
So is it sort of like you're forcing them in a way to be in a particular moment, so they kind of like close off all of the excess things that they might be.
Not necessarily, in some ways, yes. Like I just don't, that feels like almost like out there, that kind
Hmm.
of like woo like being present. It
Right.
literally is like I'm taking brain areas that are
Hmm.
responsible for like
Hmm.
what we would call inhibition, or like inhibition is just me basically being able to like get rid of like outside distractions or things that aren't important, right? I'm
Right.
able to like ignore them
Hmm.
and like focus on what I need to do. So
Hmm.
you're taking brain areas that are responsible for like that task and you're just upregulating them. So you're saying
Okay.
like, hey, like help me like by doing this thing, I'm activating a bunch of areas that are responsible for like eliminating distractions.
Right.
And then I'm just activating those areas and be like, hey, like get a little more blood, get a little more fuel there, get a little
Hmm.
more electrical activation there. And
Right.
that leads to a healthier brain area. And all of a
Right.
sudden it's working better. It'd
Hmm.
be like warming up your muscles before you go train, right?
Okay.
Like, oh, all that stuff is working better.
Right.
Okay, all that stuff's working better. So like I'm now, all that stuff that was a big deal to me emotionally, not a big deal anymore.
Hmm.
Right? All that other like all that autonomics that are getting out of hand, my heart rate, blood pressure going up.
Hmm.
Okay, I have the ability to inhibit that and like get
Right.
an appropriate autonomic response.
Hmm.
Right.
And
So
I guess what I was thinking more along the line of is like archery.
yeah.
Well, like when you're focused on the target,
Hmm.
you tend to like you're saying, you just kind of exclude everything else,
Yes.
and you're just focused on that one thing.
Hmm.
And the benefit of that, for people that are recovering from PTSD and those sorts of things,
Yep.
is that they learn to like not have all that anxiety and all those things that
Yeah.
feel like they're just
Yep.
crushing them. They can just
Yep.
focus on that one eye thing.
Very, very much so. That's a really good way to put it. Because it is like it's that ability to focus and the
Hmm.
ability to inhibit distractions are like they're like the same skill,
Right.
if that makes sense. So if
Hmm.
you give somebody, and there's two ways to look at it, right? I can basically push stuff that will help decrease distractions
Hmm.
or upregulate my inhibition,
Right.
or I will find something so important that I care about so much that I'll just focus on it and all that stuff will take care of itself.
Right.
right? That's why jujitsu is great when you have the
Yeah.
same type of guys because you're
Yeah.
like, hey, dude, I really can't think about anything else right now because this guy's kicking the shit out of me. Like, I got to
Right.
figure out a way to get out of
Yeah.
this, right?
Uh-huh.
So it's the same. For me, it's two sides of the same coin. That
Hmm.
is a really good example,
Yeah.
I think. Hmm.
That's one of the things that I love about Shih Tzu is that
Hmm.
when you're doing that and somebody's trying to choke you or put you into some other kind of submission, it's like you don't have the bandwidth really to be thinking about
Hmm.
much of anything else.
Yeah.
You really got to focus not getting submitted or, trying to like reverse the situation
Yeah.
to get,
100%.
yeah.
So,
Like,
So,
you know what really doesn't matter when I'm trying to get fucking choked out?
yeah.
My mortgage.
Yeah.
Like,
It's not a big deal.
not even thinking
It's
about
not a
it.
big deal. Or the groceries you have to go get or whatever, right? All the little stuff. You're like, I got so much to do today. You're like, no, just got to worry about this dude, this 250-pound monster right now.
yeah.
I'm feeling bad. That's literally it.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, there's a bunch of other like back end stuff that happens
Hmm.
behind the scenes, like neurologically there. But essentially, that's the idea, right?
Right.
So I just like, forgive me, I wasn't trying to critique your term of like being
Not at
present, but
all.
like I do also like I have a wide network of different communities, and there's
Hmm.
a very like woo wooey like,
Yeah.
oh, just be one with the earth, like be present community. And I'm like, fuck that, like that's super annoying. Like be real about what's happening. Like it's
Hmm.
not that just I just need to be present. It's like no, like you legit have areas that are not functioning well, so you can't be present. So either I have to put you in a situation that's important enough for you to like be present, which
Right.
is like, hey, you're getting your shit kicked in right now, or
Hmm.
if I don't have like I might not have the opportunity. Part of the reason I'm saying that is I don't might not have the opportunity to go outside and shoot a bow if I
Right.
feel like shit. Or I might not be able to go to jujitsu. Or maybe I just did. It's like 3 hours later of the day.
Right.
Like it's just so it's going like, hey, do I have other tactics? Do I have other techniques to be able
Hmm.
to actually
Right.
solve the problem
Yeah.
in another way or look at it in a different light? And that's kind of what I
Hmm.
was getting at, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
does.
Cool.
So, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but the limbic system is sort of where we store our experiences and kind of, I don't know,
Emotions is
yeah,
typically where you
emotions
would
like based
regulate with
on
that.
past
Yeah.
experiences and those
Hmm.
sort of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how does that play into the things that you work on?
Yeah. Depending on the context, if we're talking like post-traumatic stress type stuff,
Hmm.
um, that's where things like EMDR end up being really cool because I believe the term in psychology is neural chunking, where they'll like chunk motor, cognitive, and like emotional experiences
Hmm.
together. So it's very similar to like if I was to pick up my water right now and take a drink, I don't
Hmm.
have to think about like tricep extension, grip all my fingers together,
Right.
like do a bicep curl, like I don't
Yeah.
have to think about all those little things.
Yeah.
My brain, it essentially chunks all that stuff together and goes like, hey, just grab the water bottle, take it up to your mouth, take a drink. I don't have to think about all the little muscles moving,
Right.
right? So to be efficient, because your brain's trying to survive, right? First and foremost. So it wants to be efficient and not use as
Hmm.
much fuel as it can avoid using. So to be efficient, it chunks it all together and just goes, hey, there's this one big thing, go do it. Boom. Well, same thing with experiences, right? You touch a hot stove when you're a kid and you're like, oh shoot, like that burned me, like, yeah, don't touch the stove, right? So you chunk that like emotional experience together, you chunk all the stimulus that you got in your hand, getting your
Right.
hand burned off, all the nociception from that. All that stuff goes together and it builds this kind of memory, and like emotion
Hmm.
is a part of that memory. You're like, oh shit, that was bad, right?
Hmm.
You can think about that in relationships too. If you've had like relationships you with in any capacity that have been in any way negative experiences, you
Hmm.
have that emotional context that gets pulled out if you get yourself in a similar situation.
Right.
And you're like, oh, why am I getting that feeling? You have that neural chunk that's kind of stuck there,
Hmm.
right? So in that same way, all that stuff gets kind of stored together.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
So is that something at some point you have to try to separate those things so that one is not inhibiting the other?
yeah, essentially, and that's why EMDR does a does a good job at it. It's very systematic in that sense. I used to be a little bit more, I would say, liberal with the way that I would use that concept with
Hmm.
people. But again, if I'm storing motor, cognitive, and emotional experiences together as
Hmm.
one, yeah, I can keep like two of the old together and change one of the other ones.
Right.
Right. So actually can't remember this lady's name, so I probably could share the story, but it'll give you a picture because it was very intense.
Hmm.
Um, she lived in Saudi Arabia and she worked at the embassy in Saudi Arabia. And she ended up marrying a dude that was Arabian descent from out there, right? And essentially, at some point, they had been married and had like two kids. And they got to this point where like he was very abusive,
Hmm.
like to the point where like he had a knife up to her and a gas can. It was going to like light her on fire in front of her kids.
Wow.
And like I was doing like a little pro bono work at the clinic at the time because like her son came in to train with one of the other trainers, and the dude knew me. The other trainer knew me. He's like, dude, she's got some issues. Like, do you want to just like give her like a free half hour and just like help her? I was like, yeah, no problem, dude. I'm hanging out at the gym anyway, whatever. The
Right.
clinic. I'm just here at the clinic, so it's all good. And this is the story that we got into, right? And not laughing to make light of it, but it's I'm laughing because it's so intense. It's not what you would expect on your Tuesday afternoon. So we're getting into that. And so essentially, she tells me this story because I just asked her, I'm like, hey, what happened? Go into it, whatever. Um, and I can't remember why particularly I had decided to go that route as a practitioner, but for some reason I realized I needed to go somewhere more psychological in that aspect. But every time that she was talking through this story, she kept looking a certain direction. And for this example, because I can't remember, let's just say it was left, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in that instance, it was where the dude was standing that was talking to her. She's looking at her kids and then to the left because
Right.
that's where the threat's coming from. And so she told me this story. Maybe it took her, let's just say like a minute and a half, 2 minutes. Tells me the whole story. Okay, cool. Fairly intense, right? So I'm like, cool. So we have motor, cognitive, and emotional, right? So the easiest way to do this is go, eyes are super important. It's where I detect like, let's say between anywhere 70 to 90% of my sensory input. So let's use the eyes because they're just so high impact, right? So I'm like, hey, I'm going to have you look right. I'm just going to have you look over here at my thumb. And I just want you to tell me the same story. Same story took her like 5 or 6 minutes to tell because the way her brain was remembering it was through some of that motor output of where her
Right.
eyes were. So you'll see people when they tell you stories, they'll look in a direction or they'll look a certain place.
Interesting.
And you can start to ask intelligent questions about kind of where stuff was in the moment because they can picture it. Like they can feel it. Even when I'm telling this story, you could see me looking off to go like, oh,
Right.
like because it's how people remember things. It's how they chunk them
Mm-hmm.
together. So yeah, so it took her a while. Like she was forgetting parts of the story, and to go back and remember them, she would look away and be like, "Nope, look at my finger,"
Yeah.
and then she would have to pull that apart. But you're breaking apart this motor, cognitive, and emotional component. So when she comes back out of that, so eventually she tells me the whole story. We chatted through, and she's like, oh, okay, like she felt the weight of it gone, so she could talk about it without having as much of the emotional weight of it, and she felt a lot more just lighter and just kind of
Right.
less heavy about the whole thing,
I
right?
gotcha.
And so that's a really simple example. But EMDR does a very similar thing with whether they're using the vibration or they're using eye movements and
So what exactly does that stand for?
eye movement desensitization reprogramming, I believe.
Okay.
So it's just again, it's desensitizing via eye movement or whatever stimulus they're going to use, but it helps to kind of break up those neural chunks,
Right.
if you will.
Okay.
That's a term that I learned in my education was neural chunking. I know there's some of that in psychology. Some other people might have a different term for it, but
Right.
the concept still stands.
Okay. So I think that we talked about this a little bit the last time that you were with us, that um, people will have experiences. They could be very traumatic or maybe not so much, but
Hmm.
they tend to like lock on to whatever that thing is and say, well, okay, this is just where I am now.
Hmm.
So somebody like you that you had, health issues and things like that you had to deal with, somebody will develop, a health issue and say, well, I'm a victim of this now.
Hmm.
And they just sort of get locked into this idea that, well, that's just all there is,
Yeah.
you know? So talking about these things, I think is really important because it
Yeah.
helps people understand just because this is a situation that you find yourself in doesn't mean you have to stay there.
Oh yeah.
There are ways to like move something differently, whether that's, there are so many things that you can do that people may not necessarily be aware of, which I think again
Exactly.
is extremely important.
Exactly.
And so where you're focusing more on the side of like law enforcement and military, are there places, are there ways people can do these sorts of things that are dealing more with just kind of their own personal things?
Yeah.
Uh, you
Yeah,
know,
absolutely. Again, it takes a great deal of personal responsibility because you do
right,
have to go look and you have to weed through, for lack of a better term, a lot of shit that's on the internet.
right.
And probably ask some good
Well,
experts on the matter. That's the thing is like,
I guess
'cause-
a better question is like,
yeah.
how would an average person, if they've recognized that there's something going on that they want to fix,
Hmm.
like what's an easy place to kind of like start to at least?
Yeah, change your environment. Your environment's the thing that made you sick in the first place,
Okay.
right? because that's the thing that created the environment for whatever bad thing it is to thrive in your life. So environment could be relationships, it could be a physical location, it could be a workplace.
Mhm.
Like, and those are all things that are hard for people to change because
Right.
what does that end up being? You ever move houses?
Yeah.
That's pain in the ass.
Right.
It's very energetically expensive,
Right.
dude, right? Even just adapting to the new environment. You're like, oh
Mhm.
God, where's the grocery store? Like, this stuff's on autopilot, right?
Yeah.
You drive around, like, that's when I say your brain's trying to be efficient. Like,
Mhm.
you automate your drive. You drive to the grocery store and probably could be thinking the whole time and forgot you drove there,
Right.
and then drive home and kind of forget that you drove home,
Yeah.
right? So when you go to a new place, all
Mhm.
that stuff is on cognitive mode where you have to focus on all of it. You're like, shoot, I don't actually know where the grocery store is exactly here. I don't know where this is.
Mhm.
I don't know where my normal gas station is, like all that stuff.
Right.
You have to like use fuel for all of that now.
Mhm.
So that's why I say changing an environment is what creates those issues, right?
Right.
It creates an environment for whatever negative thing to have grown. And also when you change it, that's you if you're intentional during that transition, you can create an environment where you might have more healthy habits,
Right.
right? So that's what I would say
Yeah.
is change your environment, even if that's with something small.
Mhm.
Usually it's people.
Mhm. Right.
It's hard to change jobs real quick,
Yeah.
but usually it's people.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. I
it could
figure
be
that.
little stuff around the house too, right?
Yeah.
You're like, hey, I want to move more. I want to go for a walk more.
Right.
Maybe you set your socks and shoes by the door. And
Mhm.
every time you see your socks and shoes, if you work remote, let's say you work remote, just for the sake of the example, you work remote and you set your socks and shoes by the door every night before you go to bed.
Mhm.
And that's going to set you up. You're like, oh, I see that. Like, why did I set that there? Oh, so I could go on a walk. It's
Mhm.
just those little things that are going to just
Right.
they're not going to hassle you, but they're just going to give you that reminder.
Mhm.
It's the same thing if you have the negative example of people snacking too much. They're like, oh, they see the chips in the pantry, so they just grab them. Like,
Right.
if you don't have the chips in the pantry and you never bought them, the environment isn't going to dictate that you do that.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So that's why I say change your environment. It requires a little bit of intention. So that
Mhm.
needs to be a context specific solution for whatever the individual needs. However, if you understand what I'm
Mhm.
putting out, you can do a lot of little things to just go, hey,
Right.
environment, change it.
Yeah.
Whatever it's your kitchen or your gym or whatever.
I got you.
Hmm.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Um.
'Cause it makes you think, right?
Yeah.
Because you're like, shoot, there's a lot of options now.
Mhm.
And that's, yeah.
I think the funniest thing is then you've pointed this out a couple times that like ultimately that no matter how sophisticated we become as a society or as people or whatever or how smart we think we are,
Hmm.
realistically we're all still have a lizard brain. You
Yeah.
know, on some level our body or our mind is telling us to do things because it's trying to protect us even if it doesn't realize that that's causing the problem,
Yeah.
you know.
Hmm.
Um and that's kind of a fascinating concept to me that the thing that is trying to protect us is the thing that's causing the damage.
I wouldn't say necessarily causing, it depends on the context,
Right.
but maybe it's not causing damage.
I say, um, so we've talked
It,
about how important it is to have like community
yeah.
and how to
Yeah. Yeah. I get what
to
you're
be
saying.
that sort of
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Okay.
And at the
I
same
hear
time,
you.
somebody who's so introverted they have a hard time communicating with people or becoming a part of a community.
Yep.
It's like the thing that could be helping them the most is also the thing that's keeping them from it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know.
No, it's a very good observation on your part. That is where, again, that's where we talk about environment and that intention of like changing environments or changing habits of like
Hmm.
maybe part of that scarring that you've had from that social interaction.
Hmm.
That's where you have to change environments to get around people and be like, oh, this is what healthy people are like.
Right.
Oh, interesting. Like it's the same thing with jujitsu or shooting or whoever. You're
Hmm.
like, I don't go to the guy that's been shooting for 6 months. Like I go to the USPSA GM that's like really freaking good that smokes everyone.
Right.
I go, okay, what are you doing? Well, what is it like to perform in that community?
Hmm.
What is it like to perform with those guys? What is it like to like roll with the black belts at
Hmm.
jujitsu? And you're like, oh, that's what good looks like. Okay,
Right.
right? Because we are like, it's like the same way kids learn from their parents. They mirror them.
Hmm.
There's talk about mirror neurons and um, certain parts of the brain, and it's like monkey see, monkey do stuff, right?
Right.
You ask to learn something, you're like, oh, let me see you do it first. Okay, now I can
Hmm.
go do it.
Right.
So that type of interaction of like mirroring experts,
Right.
that's again, it's environmental. That's why I said that, like probably one of the better things to do is just change the people or go to an environment where there are people that are
Right.
competent at the thing that you want to be good at.
Yeah.
So if it's social interaction, like, but again, if we're talking about social interaction, I don't look at it as different than jujitsu or shooting. You're just like, hey, it's gonna suck. You're probably
Mhm.
gonna fail.
Right.
Part of learning, dude.
Yeah.
You get a dopamine hit from those little missteps, and dopamine is a big deal in learning. And you just go boom. That's how you're gonna make some of those adaptations, though, is those
Right.
learning lessons.
Yeah.
So
And that's another thing I think that people need to realize is that the way that you learn is by making mistakes.
yeah,
You
it's
know, if
always
you
yeah.
if you just go in and do something and it's perfect the first time, well, you didn't really learn anything. Obviously, you already knew that.
Or you learn that that worked.
Yeah.
So you can get it right the first time. You go, cool, that's awesome. I got, I did okay that time. And then this next time, I actually want to improve this and this because
Hmm.
maybe if this person was better, I would have got caught here.
Right.
And so, like, you
Yeah.
have these little, yeah, you have these moments because
Mhm.
there's like, it's reinforcement for learning. You
Yeah.
get a positive,
Definitely.
but you hit a Kimura for the first time. You're like, fuck yeah, that's how you do that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Because you learn something, then you're like, oh, fuck, that worked.
Hmm.
Right. You catch someone with something on the mat, you're like, oh yeah, now I can hit this on. Do you know what I mean? Because that
Yeah. Yeah.
sticks. So there's both ends of that spectrum
Right.
where like there should be failure,
Hmm.
but there should be success too.
Yeah.
You need to win, or else you don't know what works. So there's this whole thing of like you just have
Hmm.
to get out there and go do
Right.
stuff though, because you
Yeah.
have to have some sort of reps to be able to emulate what you want to do,
Right.
right?
Uh, Another thing that I think that is important is that aside from all of like what we would call like our daily performance benefits, that
Hmm.
sort of thing, right?
Yeah.
The other aspect of this is that as biological units, we need to be in motion. We need to like have exercise. We need to
Mm.
be doing something so that we don't become stagnant. You know, you
Yes.
see like this happens with elderly people, right? They get to a certain point where the motion has become uncomfortable or maybe even painful.
Yeah.
And so they allow that just to stop them. And it's like,
Hmm.
again, the thing that would be helping them the most is the thing that's like, it's almost counterproductive. I don't know if
Yeah.
that's the right way to say it, but
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where I have to. That's where I have this interesting talk with people about that whole neuro aspect of it, of
mhm,
like the thing that that's people get an interesting mentality in this community because they go, well, just need to suck it up and get through it. And I'm
mhm,
like, maybe, or maybe we need to look at better options. Like,
right.
why are you like, maybe you just need to have, but that's a lot of effort now. Now we're talking
Uh-huh.
about real effort. Instead,
Yeah.
pushing through pain's fucking easy. If you've done it enough times, you just go, okay, cool. This sucks for a little bit and then we'll get through it and it's fine.
Hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Like eventually you get enough reps at that and you're like, cool, like I know kind of where I can stretch myself to and I probably won't die. I'll be
Right.
fine. It's actually the intentional aspect on the other side of that that is like, hey, why are you having that pain then?
Hmm.
Why is that movement creating pain? Like, do you want to have that conversation and go down that rabbit hole? Because that's going to take a lot of effort
Right.
rather than just doing other randomized stuff and hoping it works. And that's where I know that's play devil's advocate a lot, you can tell. Because there is that element of, hey, maybe that's the answer, but maybe it's not. Maybe
Right.
that will make you worse. Maybe that will create, so that's exactly it. That'll create
Hmm.
a more negative adaptation.
Hmm.
Because if I keep getting it's a protective response pain,
Hmm.
right? From a movement standpoint.
Right.
And I keep going, hey, this movement creates pain.
Hmm.
And I keep doing that movement and it makes the pain worse because my brain turns up the signal and goes, hey, you're being a dumbass right now because I
Right.
told you this wasn't fucking good for us. Like, do you know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
Because there's legit something wrong in some way, shape, or form. It might not
Right.
be your knee if you're having knee pain because it's
Hmm.
not how that works, but there's something wrong.
Hmm.
That's where like we do have to have a conversation of like, I think there's just nuance to that. But
Right.
like, yeah, you need to find a way to move that is
Hmm.
not creating threat
Right.
if that's what we're trying to do.
Hmm.
Right. And that's the intelligence. That's where I preach a lot about just being smart about how you do things.
Right.
Because yeah, like you can do it arbitrarily, but I'm also coming from these communities that are like, just suck it up and get through it and blah, 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 blah. And that's great. And then 20 years fucking later, you're burnt out and all your buddies are committing suicide and all this shit because they're fucked up
Hmm.
because that was your mentality.
Right.
And you never understood like, hey, at some point we have to take a look inside and go, hey, there's some shit wrong here.
Yeah.
And we have to go and actually like address those issues. Cause like the answer to everything is not just like eat shit and get through it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I preach, I'll say it on this side. There's two sides of the spectrum, right? Dr. Cobb G Health was great because he made this little analogy that's called the threat bucket.
Okay.
And this threat bucket is just like, hey, you get enough stressors in here. It's like, okay, I have my finances in there. I have my relationships are in there, my movement patterns, all my dysfunction and good things, all those things, right?
Right.
Eventually, if we get enough negative stimulus in this bucket or enough stressful stimulus, you get an output because it overflows, right?
Right.
And that would be a protective stimulus. That could be an
Mhm.
emotional output. That could be pain or tension. That could be any of those things, right?
Mhm.
So, as a practitioner, it would always be my first instinct to help empty the bucket. So, remove threat from the bucket. What things are creating threat? Eye movement dysfunction, vestibular dysfunction, whatever, right?
Mhm.
Sensory issues here, movement issues here. Go fix those things. Take threat out of the bucket, right?
Okay.
Big deal. That's what I'm so the communities that I'm working with in some ways, they forget that. They just go, suck it up and get through it. You're fine.
Right.
It's okay if it overflows. There's a time and a place for that, dude. Like we need that.
Yeah, definitely.
That's a skill, and I'm not discounting that skill,
Mhm.
right? It's important. So people in that community tend to not think and like they go like, just keep filling it up. And when we just go, hey, we should just take some stuff out of there. Like this would be a hell of a lot easier if we just like fix those eye movement issues real quick, or we just did this thing real quick,
Mhm.
right? So there's that side of it. There's one extreme in the health and wellness industry, which is the woo woo people that are like, just be present, that are like, oh, just always reduce threat, always just make things better for people.
Mhm.
There's time and a place for that. But
Right.
that's all we do. Then you just got this small ass fucking cup that's like this big and you can't handle shit. So my other thing that I would tell people, particularly in that community, 'cause this is what I would tell to like the practitioner side a lot, especially when I was working uh, as an educator, was like, dude, sometimes you just got to give people a bigger bucket too.
Right.
You got to teach them to get a bigger bucket. That's what the jujitsu is for. That's what the hey, get out and move mentality is for,
Mhm.
right? You're like, hey, you might just have to get out and move. Like,
Mhm.
find a way to walk that doesn't hurt you, or
Right.
find some way to do movement that doesn't hurt you.
Mhm.
But we have to go. Sorry, keep hitting that. We have to go between both sides of that spectrum, where
Mhm.
it's not just hey, eat shit and get through it, and it's not just hey, like just make everything feel good. Like there has to be some sort of intelligent medium in between the two.
Right.
So that's where hopefully that makes sense why I go into that because
Yeah.
like the dudes in our community will just be like, yeah, just do it, go through
Yeah.
everything, and then you just end up fucked up, and then you're like, oh well, I couldn't work out for like 5 years because like my knee and my back and this thing, and I'm like, how productive was that whole mentality generally? I'm like, you just
Yeah.
lost 5 years of training adaptations.
Right.
Terrible. That's awful.
Yeah.
Anyways, sorry,
And
get off.
so on that point too, there's the idea that like that mentality, like you said, in
Mhm.
some situations, it really is vitally important.
You need it.
You know, your survival almost depends on it, right?
Mhm.
And so it's really easy to kind of default to that and say, well, that's how we should handle everything,
Mhm.
right? But not only do they think that way, they give shit to other people who aren't, and that's where it becomes kind of like what's the word? It just sort of expands and just becomes like a thought for everybody,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. In some situations,
Yeah,
like it is the right answer,
yeah,
just not all situations.
right.
So that's why like I caveat stuff and I'm like, I don't really blanket statement stuff. The only
Hmm.
blanket statements you hear me say is like everything lives in the brain because it does.
Yeah.
But other than that, most things have like I say context a lot because things require context.
Hmm.
Things require that nuance.
Yeah.
Like that might be a good idea to push through it. Also might not be. It also might be a really good idea to like, hey, go over here and address this quick. And then you can go push through it.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah.
So like you said, I think extremes of thinking tend to get people into trouble
It,
because you'll use that extreme everywhere.
right.
Like, I don't know if anyone's been like married, like if you take that mentality for yourself, you're just like, I'll suck it up and get through it. And you try to tell your wife that. Sometimes there's a time I've told my wife that and she's
Okay.
taken to it because she's like, fuck, you're right. But then if I try to do that for everything, like
Hmm.
you're eventually you're gonna miss some, man.
Right.
It's gonna be bad. So that's why I go. I'm just using that marriage example so people can think about it because it's relatable. Like it doesn't work,
Right.
but if you do that for yourself too, like it's not gonna work. You're gonna lead. It might work in the short term, but
Right.
long term, you're gonna run into some issues at some point, right?
So on the marriage front, though, that's actually an excellent point, though, because that thought process, again, where it might work in certain situations, right? It isn't so much that it's a bad thing for you to say that to your wife.
Hmm.
It might be a bad thing for her perspective of how she receives that.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah,
because women and men just think differently. They don't,
yeah.
communicate the same way, right? So I was listening to an interview with John Lovell, and he was talking about how his relationship with his wife started, when they first got married, and like the the miscommunications, and he's coming at it from his door kicking ranger perspective of, well,
Yeah.
just do it.
Yeah.
And that is not at all how she's receiving that
Yeah.
information. Right.
Hmm.
So it requires more tact
No tact.
than,
Yeah.
than than just that. And
Hmm.
also understanding that they're not necessarily going to understand it the same way that you do.
Yeah.
They don't have your set of experiences. They don't have
Yeah.
whatever,
Hmm.
So
You need good leadership skills to be
and
a good coach.
right.
I look at it as coaching. Not that I'm my wife's coach per se,
Hmm.
but like if I'm going through some shit, like I need a coach. I need someone to tell me like, hey, outside perspective, what do you got? Right. I
Right.
need her communication skills to be on point. I just use the communication skills from coaching to go, hey,
Hmm.
like what does the athlete, in this instance, my wife, what does the athlete need from
Hmm.
me in order to receive this message? Because
Hmm.
I could just say eat shit and get through it, or I could provide that
Right.
perspective in a different way.
Yeah.
And that's where I go, hey, the onus is still on me because
Hmm.
that's my leadership skill, my communication skill to be
Right.
able to get that message across in a way that's efficient and doesn't turn into
Hmm.
an emotional battle per se.
Right.
Right. So yes, you are 100% correct.
Yeah. Because I know that there are husbands and wives that train together and do things,
Hmm.
and some of them do it really well because they do have that communication.
Hmm.
And there's others that will just like that becomes its own battle,
Oh
and
yeah.
then that then nobody's getting helped.
The amount of trainers that you've heard say like, "Oh, I don't train my wife." I'm like,
Yeah.
"That's because you probably suck at communicating."
Right.
To be fair, like just to be frank, like, or yeah, or your spouse is whatever, but it's the same idea, right? You
Right.
have to again. That's where
Yeah.
you got to have that stuff ironed out.
So just out of curiosity, how did you meet your wife?
We met in the Dallas Fort Worth airport. We were at a sales conference for a direct sales company. We are both like 20 or something.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and we both didn't like each other at the time. And then 3 months later, we're dating, and then what is it? 10 months after that, we were married. So yeah,
Nice.
that went well. Yeah.
So when you initially tried to like train her or teach her things, was there resistance,
No,
or was it
no,
pretty?
no. That when we were dating, she was much more soft spoken.
Hmm.
She came from an environment growing up that did not allow her to share how she felt or her perspective as much,
Hmm.
and it was not encouraged. So when
Right.
she got with me, I'm used to athletics, team environment. Hey, tell me how you're feeling, because like I need to know. I make better decisions
Hmm.
if you give me good information about how we're all doing.
Right.
I'll make better decisions with that information. She didn't come from that environment. She came from
Yeah.
like, oh, like this guy's in charge. Like
Right.
just I just keep my mouth shut, and then eventually that bottles up and that can explode, right?
Yeah.
So like fostering an environment where like not only is she allowed to share that stuff, but she's encouraged to, and it's
Hmm.
actually necessary for the team to succeed
Hmm.
because we need that information to make good decisions for the team.
Right.
So that whole interaction, if that makes sense, you can understand. Like, eventually, initially, it was like cool. She actually didn't mind training with me, and then
Hmm.
there was a period where she was like didn't want to take that advice from me, and then it came full circle to like, oh yeah, like now we're like tight knit, like team,
Hmm.
like we're gonna make each other better in a
Hmm.
lot of ways. That's why we'll shoot together. That's why we'll grapple together. We'll
Right.
take freaking badge cam videos of grappling incidences, and we'll go to the DT room and train it out. And we'll go here.
Right.
This is this pass. This is this. Boom, 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 and we'll because that's what it looks like,
Hmm.
at least for us in a healthy dynamic.
Right.
We can both give feedback, and then we're both. She's calling out what I missed. I'm calling out what she missed, and now we have one better solution
Right.
because we're both together.
Hmm.
So
That's.
initially, there's some resistance in there,
Hmm.
but again, instead of avoiding it, which I made the reference to the other trainers that are like, oh, we just don't do that. Instead of avoiding it, you work through it
Right.
because that could be an emotional issue from another
Hmm.
instance of her childhood, my childhood, our other issues that we're working through at the time, and it might not be the coaching itself, right?
Right.
But it could reveal other things that we need to work on that just give us an opportunity to grow.
Yeah.
So through that, it's been a useful thing, and now it's just, hey, we can just show up and get after it.
Right.
Like, hey, what are you working on? What do we need to do? Right?
So that's really an impressive thing because,
Hmm.
like I said, I know that a lot of times people don't have that communication skill. They don't have the ability to to not only communicate and
Hmm.
and demonstrate that, but to be able to set their egos aside.
Yeah.
I know that's kind of a big thing too. Like,
Mhm.
when you have an ego and the other person has one too, especially if they both tend to be alpha type personalities,
Mhm.
there's going to be a lot of like friction about, who's in charge,
Mhm.
and I think it's really important to be able to like set that aside and
Mhm.
just focus on what needs to be done,
Yeah. Oh, it
because
is.
ultimately, like
Mhm.
you're saying, you're a team.
Yeah.
You're trying to accomplish a mission,
Yeah.
which is that requires that you're
That's it.
working together.
That's it. If you keep the goal the main thing, and that's even in the training industry, that's where I look for people that I
Hmm.
like look for people that are mission oriented
Hmm.
because those are the people that like they don't give a shit if they're right or wrong, like in and of themselves.
Right.
They just want to do the right thing or they want to do what's best for the group or
Hmm.
whoever they're working for.
Right.
And that's the same thing in the marriage where you're just like, hey, like we're just trying to like be the best we can. So like if you're
Yeah.
right and I'm wrong, fucking all more power to you. Like I actually like I've encouraged that for so many years with her. I'm like, dude,
Right.
I cannot be the guy all the time. Like
Yeah.
I'm not that good. Like I can't be right all the time.
Hmm.
It's just not no one is.
Right.
So it's like I need you to cover my blind spots. Like I need you to be assertive so you can.
Right.
And that's the beauty of that partnership. It's like
Right.
because someone, dude, when you're married, you're like they just know all your weak points, and they
Yeah.
should be able to cover them. Like,
Right.
cool, you're missing this, you're missing this. Oh, I got you on that. Like that's how it should be. That's how a
Hmm.
good team works, right?
Right.
Got you six. That's it.
Hmm.
So that's the idea. Like you said, as long as you're mission focused.
Right.
Hmm.
So, and I also think that same concept should be applied parenting,
Hmm.
because it isn't do this because I said so. There's a time for that because you don't have time to explain it,
Hmm.
but there's an overall time to say, I need you to understand that this is why we're doing what we're doing.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
It isn't just because I said so,
That's good teaching. It's
Yeah.
good leadership, right?
So, yeah.
Yeah. Like again, you can find out what can get them to buy into why we're doing this. If
Mhm.
you have that culture,
Right.
and then again, they can share the feedback of like, or I don't understand this, or I don't like this for the like you can have that conversation. And
Right.
again, how long that looks like, or like
Right.
what that looks like is different in different environments. But
Hmm.
yeah, again, leadership and coaching.
Right.
It's just that skill, right?
Yeah.
That we can all just keep improving.
So, just out of curiosity, like how much of that of your own personal skill in that particular regard,
Hmm.
where do you feel like most of that came from?
Good question. I think I spent time in certain organizations where you don't like what leadership is doing, so you learn what
Hmm.
not to do. I'm
Right.
also the youngest of three brothers.
Okay.
So you get to be in a team environment at home.
Hmm.
You get to be in a team environment. And I was a team captain on most of the teams I was on for soccer. And so you get this balance of like, oh, I know what it feels like to be kind of treated like shit in an organization. So you're like,
Right.
okay, I don't want to make people feel like that, but I need them to get on side and be able to like push in the same direction as me
Hmm.
because I know what needs to get done. And so figuring that out, I think youth athletics is a big deal, right? I
Okay.
think that's a massive and that's where I actually find it really interesting that you do have a lot of kids doing individual sports like wrestling and gymnastics and stuff these
Hmm.
days. And those are all really good things physically. But there's a team dynamic that exists in some of these open skill environments
Hmm.
like your soccers and your basketballs and things like that, where things are just moving and you've got to be able to communicate and work together fast on the fly.
Right.
There's an element to that I got a very healthy dose of growing up and
Hmm.
and having that in my entire like athletic career. So there's a lot that comes from mostly that, honestly, that I would think of. And then you get to develop that and translate that into, hey, what does that look like in coaching and training and things like that? Because
Hmm.
then again, there's a lot of can't tell you how many freaking hours of coaching and personal training sessions that you develop and you go, oh, okay, this is how I can get a 65-year-old to trust me and like get on board with me and
Hmm.
like and this person that's doing this job. So I've kind of had that networking ability
Right.
generally to be able to go in and be relatable to different populations, but then taking those communication skills and kind of molding it to that individual.
Right.
So I would say athletics and personal training for a long time probably helped me with that.
Hmm.
So it's been good.
So, in the clients and people that you're working with now, do you still occasionally run into people that are just that have a hard time accepting what you're trying to impart to them?
In some ways, yes. It's less. I'm at least good enough in certain individual settings, and I don't take a lot of individual clients these days. It's mostly friends and family, so that I
Right.
don't run into that.
Right.
Occasionally, occasionally I have other people. The thing is, they can't knock the credibility of the work. because they'll come to me with like a neck pain or a back pain or something, and
Right.
you'll get rid of it, and they'll be like, well, like, they can't not acknowledge the fact that that just happened. So we're there, and like I have enough of this spiel. I kind of know how to explain stuff now, so I can get people on side. The other part of it is though, like getting people that actually give a shit enough to like work hard
Right.
and do work outside and make the adaptations and change certain habits and environments. Like that's something I can't do for you.
Right.
So finding people like that, that's probably where the bigger shortcomings are. I
Mhm.
would say there are some in a larger scope of like maybe like the gun industry and the open market training industry,
Mhm.
where like people are so used to being like the man that
Right.
they have a hard time going like, oh, why the fuck would I do that like vision work? Like, well, I can explain it to you, but like your mentality isn't really open to the fact that like
Right.
for us to actually have this conversation anyway.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it's very behind on the human performance. That sector's very behind on the human performance aspect of things, but that's where like I I buy truth, I don't sell it. So that makes sense.
So that's a phrase I don't think I've ever heard before.
That's old proverbs. That's proverbs. It's just like,
Okay.
yeah, I'll go out and get the right stuff and I'll share with the people that, but I'm not going to sit here and convince you.
Right.
I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, we need to have an argument about this. Like, dude, it's physiology. Like, I'm literally just like, I'm basically reading out of an anatomy book.
Mhm.
That's all I'm just giving you. And I'm just practically applying it in real time
Mhm.
for you. So
Right.
like, I'll answer your questions. If you have a genuine lack of understanding, then I'm always happy to have that conversation.
Mhm.
Just if you come at me just like argumentative because you like just don't like it, like I don't why am I gonna have a conversation with you? I don't care.
Right.
That's fine. Don't like it somewhere else. Like I don't care.
Right.
So you know what I mean? If you want to have a conversation about some like actual technical aspects, like I'm all for it, dude.
Yeah.
Like I love sharing knowledge and teaching. Like that's what I do.
Right.
So like
So
hopefully that makes sense.
no, no, it
That's some
does.
kind of
So it's not like having a conversation about like politics where it's mostly opinion.
yeah,
I mean that you there are facts on either side,
yeah,
but largely it still depends on your perception of those facts and or what you just decide that you want to believe or not.
yeah,
Those are things you can argue about. When it
yeah,
comes to physiology,
yeah,
there's not a question about it. It just is.
yeah. That's why some people like I had some people that are like 30-year like special operations vets that are like, well, this is my experience. I'm like, yeah, I can explain your experience through physiology.
Hmm.
You just don't like this other piece of physiology that you've heard before from someone else because it doesn't match your experience.
Right.
It doesn't mean just because I used that concept that someone misexplained that it's wrong. It's
Right.
just that you don't get it. That's okay.
Yeah.
But you will also have to have enough of an open mind to have that conversation with me too.
Right.
So there's like you said, egos goes back to
Yeah.
that whole thing of like, hey, like I'm just going to do right by the team. I'm
Right.
going to make sure I serve the mission of the team, make sure everyone gets better around me.
Hmm.
And if you're in a position where you're not open to getting better via this
Hmm.
medium, or like the only way that you know how to have a conversation is to like poo poo stuff, and hopefully I come back with you with an angry response, like I don't have one for you, man. I
Yeah.
don't care if you want to be an idiot, you can stay an idiot. There's a lot of stupid people out there that want to stay stupid. Like
Right.
stay stupid, bro. I don't have time. Don't cast pearls before swine.
Right.
It's too much energy for too little
Right.
output. Like I have too many smart people that give a shit about what they're doing that I'd rather take that same time with and get 10x the return
Right.
on like for the team of humanity,
Hmm.
right? So don't waste my time.
Right. So, kind of on that thought right there, where do you hope that your business and the things that you're doing go to? Like, what do you look at as the future?
What do I look at as the future? That's a really good question. So this is actually really fun when I did some of that rebranding because I actually got to think about this. Not that I was like writing out vision statements or anything. Part of my philosophy that I put down in some of those sections was that like I want to take really high level human performance stuff and just get it in the hands of most individuals.
Hmm.
So I obviously have a heart for military law enforcement and all that training.
Right.
Like there's a lot of fun stuff that I do in that community that I
Hmm.
do personally and that I do for that community that I think is super beneficial. Because if those guys are putting their asses on the line every day, like I think they deserve to have this information
Right.
more so than anyone else, really. So like pushing it to that community is a big deal, and then generally pushing that to everyone. Because so that's where I have this corporate wellness section
Right.
where because corporate wellness is in my mind it's easier to get funding for in some sense because an organization can get behind that, but
Mhm.
it's easier to create behavior change in a culture or a community that already exists.
Mhm.
With an individual, that's a much more difficult proposition. But if you get 50 people in a room doing vision work and they just go, hey, we just have to do like 5 minutes of vision work together a day, and like everyone's happier and like interacting better in the workplace,
Mhm.
that's a easier way to create behavior change.
Right.
So for me, the long-term idea is how can you bring this type of knowledge to as many people as possible in these environments and actually create the change behind it that
Mhm.
it's normal, right? Where these concepts that we're talking about with
Right.
emotional outputs and hey, your vision was messed up because you're in front of a computer all day and that's why you had that emotional output. Like
Right.
if that stuff's a normal conversation, that's a normal conversation in my household. So my wife and I can look at each other and be like, hey, I'm low on fuel right now. Like I'm low on calories for the day, which means don't talk about anything that's emotionally volatile. If we have to talk about like an in-law or something, do you know what I mean? Like
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
Like pick your topic of like frustration that could be potentially
Mhm.
emotionally bounding. Like you don't talk about it then. Because you go,
Right.
hey, I'm taxed. Like for me, it was like I told you, I was like, I've trained 8 sessions in the last 5 days. Like I'm fucking tired, right?
Mhm.
Like I can just feel my body just needs to recover.
Mhm.
So if my wife and I, like, she starts to bring up a topic, I go, hey man, like now's not the time for it. If unless it's urgent, you suck it up and get through it. But if it's not urgent, we just
Right.
need to move it on. And so if everyone's having conversations to that degree with that amount of emotional intelligence, I
Right.
think the world just becomes a better place.
That's very true.
So long term, I'm like, hey, like, how do I bring this stuff out to people? We're like, hey, if you did a couple pencil push-ups, like, you will have a better family life, and your kid won't have to go to therapy. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, because
Right.
that's a real thing,
Yeah.
dude. You work this job because you want to provide, and like,
Yeah.
you miss some of these other elements that are being created by
Mhm.
that environment. So I say, okay, cool, corporate wellness side, go deal with normal people, create an avenue for like massive amounts of behavior change and to get this information out to a large amount of people. And then on the military police side, like I do have some other stuff in the works with some
Mhm.
police organizations and actually getting some of that material out nationwide to departments.
Mhm.
Still in the works, obviously, but having some more systemic programming to go, hey, cops don't have a lot of human performance stuff. They just don't have access to a lot of it. So giving some of those elements, especially the elements that will train more cognition and like emotion and helping them settle out of that fight or flight mode to be able to recover off the job, to be
Mhm.
able to have better skills for decision making and like emotional control on the job, and then just
Mhm.
injury resilience and other things. Giving that in kind of a systemized fashion to the law enforcement community, I think will be really good. And
Mhm.
then um, I'll see where the military stuff takes me. A lot of that is more like piece by piece contracting, where you're like, hey,
Right.
come out here and do this thing with like our PTSD clinic and help our clinicians out here, our human performance team, or come out here with
Mhm.
these pilots and like talk to our human performance team about vision work and vestibular work we should be doing.
Mhm.
So that's more piece by piece. We'll see what
Right.
that ends up as. But the law enforcement and the actual Gen Pop stuff,
Mhm.
I like to see those things grow in those directions because that will, for me, it's about influencing culture at least
Right.
at the end of it, and then creating that so that's a normal thing for people, and that kind of intelligent thought process
Yeah.
is pervasive.
That's really a very that's an excellent strategy for what you're trying to accomplish.
I hope so.
Yeah. Yeah. Because culture influences everything.
Yeah,
And so if it just like you're saying, if you can get this to the point where this is not some really out of reach concept for people, if it's an everyday kind of thing that they can embrace, it makes it much easier. And then does just become part of kind of our mainstream way of
yeah,
thinking about
yeah.
things.
Well, I even had an opportunity, and I got to. This is more recent, but I'll look into this as it permits. But I was talking to a gentleman in my neighborhood, a really good dude who homeschools his kids,
Hmm.
and there's these certain organizations that you can create a course for homeschooled kids.
Hmm.
And he's like, you should put your course up. You should make a course for kids and then put it up on this thing so
Right.
parents can buy it and teach it. And I was like, yep, that'll be. So there's just little things like that where like, no,
Right.
I'll make time for that
Hmm.
because that's an easy one. Like
Hmm.
finances aside, whatever. It's always good to have more money because you can
Right.
use that capital to do good things, but it's also like, hey, like there you go. Like that's an avenue where
Right.
like kids are coming up with this stuff. Cause like
Hmm.
that was the most fun. Teaching kids is so easy because they're super receptive. They don't
Right.
know right from left anyway.
Hmm.
So if you teach them good stuff, like I have the moral compass and the ethics to know like I'm teaching you good stuff.
Right.
So like I don't have to worry about it. But if I can influence you guys early and kind of set your perspective and
Hmm.
direction,
Right.
that's that's world changing, right? That
It
looks
really
good for
is.
the next 100
Yeah.
years for society.
Hmm.
So Yes, there's little things like that I will I'll
Mhm.
just plug myself into.
Yeah, I
And
would love
again,
to
it's
see
stuff I
some
don't
more of
talk
that.
about, but I just go,
Yeah,
that's the type of shit that I'm like, that's important. Do that.
right.
Right.
Yeah, just for my own thing, this is something I've been thinking about for a while and haven't really taken too much time to focus on it. But I would love to develop team building exercises specifically for kids,
Hmm.
um, like that are not sports related, but just like their own, like interactive things that they do together to build skills
Hmm.
of working together, especially like with people who have like large number of kids, like get all of those siblings to work together and
Hmm.
not just be in constant combat with each other.
Yeah.
I think would be a really important thing,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Um, but aside from that, just I love the idea that you're working on something that is, how do I say this? I think that we depend entirely too much on the government and on organization, like large organizations
Hmm.
for things, right?
Yep.
So like the vets that are coming out, coming back from like warfare and those sorts of things, they tend to lean very heavily on the VA.
Hmm.
And I think that's the obviously that is not working for them.
Nope.
That system is fairly broken because how can they manage everybody?
Hmm.
The government as a whole is not good at organization on that level.
Hmm.
At least that's my opinion.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so more and more of these things that we develop on our own that people can actually have access to and not depend on an organization like that to try to dole it out as they see
Hmm.
fit or as their funding and whatever else allows.
Yeah.
That's a big
Or an
deal.
education system in general.
Yeah.
Because I had a lot of doctors, like
Hmm.
high level medical professionals,
Hmm.
people that have been in their field for 30 plus years, like pediatric cardiologists and people that were experts in the valley here that would lean on me and refer me out to people because the education they got was not sufficient to give to these people, or they couldn't prescribe. They prescribed medicine, right?
Right.
Or like certain things. But what they had and what they were giving out was not enough for their patients. So they
Hmm.
would have me dole it out for them.
Right.
Right. And so you're talking about systems like an education system that is severely lacking
Hmm.
when you can talk about why that is, whether it's the people funding it and creating it or whatever else.
Right.
That's a different conversation.
Hmm.
But just tit for tat, like the facts are, like it's not giving, like it's not a wellness based system, at
Right.
least medicine. So if you're going to go one step past the VA, if you just want to look at medicine in general,
Hmm.
medicine in this country is the best emergency medicine in the face of the planet. If you're going to get shot or hit by a car, do it here.
Right.
Fucking awesome. Anything else, like they're responsible to keep you alive. They're not going to keep you
Right.
thriving. They're not going to keep you well. That's not their fucking job.
No.
And even our fitness industry is not about wellness. It's about aesthetics.
Hmm.
If you look at everything is based on looks, how someone looks, blah 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 blah. Your appearance. That's fine. That's still not about wellness.
Right.
Because I can tell you a list of all those people that I've talked to that are like, oh, you have massive hormonal issues and pituitary gland issues. You have massive like emotional, like mental health issues.
Hmm.
Like, okay, like, so it's not about how you how you
No.
perform. It's just about how you look. That's cool. I just want to make that distinction. I'm not mad at you for it,
Right.
and I'm not mad at you for doling it out. Let's just make a very clear distinction about what it's about. So we're going to talk about for me, it is like
Hmm.
you want to take it one step. The VA is a byproduct of one, the government trying to do something, and
Hmm.
then two, an education system in medicine that is severely lacking when it comes to keeping people healthy and thriving long term.
Right.
So it's the combination of those two things, which just is not great. Let's just
Hmm.
very honestly, it's terrible. So in some ways, so if you want to talk about system, that's it. So you're talking
Right.
about VA. I'll go back to all these things like
Hmm.
education, which is
Oh
like
yeah.
medicine. Talking about health and wellness, you're talking about all these things, and you're going like, yeah, I think you're all severely lacking.
Hmm.
And I'll die on that hill. Basically, is what I'm
Right.
telling you. Yeah, I'll go toe for toe on that. And then
Yeah.
if you have a good counter argument, I'm willing to listen. But
No,
I
I
don't think
agree
anyone does.
100%. It
Yeah,
doesn't matter if you have six pack abs if you can't function as a human being.
yeah. Ask the people that come to jujitsu gym from CrossFit and other stuff.
Yeah.
You get fucking broken instantly. You just get injured in the first week. I'm like, yeah,
Yep.
yeah, you're not built for that, man,
Hmm.
right? You don't train a certain way. So, yeah, that's hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah.
I kind of go on some rabbit holes, but there's some long term vision here. I just keep my head down and just
Right.
work little by little, just those connections that we make, and just keep building slowly, step by step. Good
Yeah.
foundation, right?
Right.
Yep. So
So
make the most of these 80 to 100 years I have on this earth.
there you go. That's
Mhm.
the important part. leave the world a better place for you being in it.
Exactly. That's
So
the idea.
there you go.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, I think that's a good place for us to wrap up.
Perfect.
Is there anything else that you wanted to like share as far as like not necessarily people finding you, but finding more information about the things that they can or where to learn more about these things?
Yeah, my Instagram page is pretty much where I post most of my content. So tony.j.rhine on Instagram. And then I'm Tony Rhine on YouTube too. I'll share some stuff over there as well. Not as consistently, but it'll mostly be the Instagram stuff. So those two places are a good place to find me. Always feel free to reach out in DMs and contact me if you do got questions. And yeah, NeuroWay Tactical, NeuroWaySolutions.com. If any of those like the corporate wellness stuff, or if you work for a government agency and you want to talk about some contracting work, any of that stuff is available for you. I'm more than happy to have a discussion. And yeah, that's where you can find me.
Awesome. I greatly appreciate you coming back on
Absolutely.
and
Thanks for
checking
having
out
me in the
the studio.
updated studio,
Right.
updated activities as well. I love it.
Right. Yeah. That's
Mhm.
awesome.
Sweet.
Thank you, brother.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also, you can now support the Non-Victim Nation by donating via listener support directly on Spotify. Remember, the story of your life is being written right now, and you are the hero.